agenda for the day is going to be what?
It was cluster workflow templates, queuing, and desire to source. You can get parameters from config maps, but you can't get them from secrets, which is an odd asymmetry.
Yes. All right. I'll pause the music. Let's get into cluster workflow templates discussion. So I'll share that bit of the Slack conversation. So yeah, Dennis brought up, want to use workflow template under multiple namespaces when running Argo template create with namespace. It does not override the namespace in the YAML. What other options do we have other than having the same workflow template copied, pasted for each namespace? And the answer to that is from Alan, use a cluster workflow template. So could you dive in a little bit on cluster workflow templates and when or why you would want to use them?
So a cluster workflow template is not a namespaced object. It lives across the cluster, accessible if you've got the appropriate role-based access control to access it from any workflow, from any namespace. Other than that, it works exactly the same as a workflow template. You might want to use it for common templates that you want everybody in every namespace to be able to use. Things like, for example, if you've got a common Git clone process or a notifications process, or anything really that you want everybody to be able to use, rather than installing into each of their individual namespaces, you can put it as cluster one, and then everybody can access it. You can obviously restrict who can access it using RBAC. The downside is that if somebody wants to make an update to it, they can't have their own version of it, but they can always clone it, make it a workflow template, which is just removing the word cluster from its name and giving it a namespace, from its kind and giving it a namespace. And then you can use it as a workflow template locally until you've got a version that you're willing to push back up for cluster as a cluster workflow template.
Definitely makes sense. It's really just a function of scoping, whether you want the workflow template scoped to the individual namespace or scoped to the cluster for kind of wide sharing. And that's a good development flow that you mentioned. We used a cluster workflow template in Severn from a Cure in my ArgoCon talk in, I think, 2020 or 2021, where they put the creation of the Dask deployment. So, they're spinning up a Dask scheduler and they want that to be shared, throughout every single namespace, just because it's a common component. And putting it in a cluster workflow template kind of does wonders for that use case. So continue, Alan.
It's just because it's a slightly unusual thing, people aren't usually aware of it. So if you're not aware, you are now.
Lessons. All right. Any other things that we should go over on the cluster workflow templates?
So Dennis went on to two things. When you use a cluster workflow template, you are always running, your actual workflow is always namespaced and has the same rules as any other workflow. So its access control is done through the service account that it's running under. So it doesn't have any special abilities because it's a cluster workflow template. It's got no differences from any other kind of workflow. Dennis was also trying to submit these from the user interface, which is a currently poor experience because you can't target a specific namespace when you press the submit button, which is an open feature, as Anton helpfully pointed out. So if anybody's looking for something to implement and loves a bit of UI work, there we go. it's probably a relatively simple one. Says somebody who
Very
has
nice.
no idea how to write UI stuff.
Definitely I don't know, another world to jump into if you ever feel like taking up the mantle. Um, but yeah, it's as far as Dennis's question, I think it's a good one for people just so they can get the right like mental model around security in place. Just because the workflow template isn't scoped to an individual namespace and has access to be used in all of the different namespaces doesn't mean the actual code that's getting run within the context of your workflow that's invoking that cluster workflow template is going to have access to all of the namespaces. That would just be a pretty obvious like permission escalation that you would want to avoid. Right. Cool. Let's take a look at the next item on the list. This was the stopping existing workflows or queuing. I thought this discussion was pretty interesting. So seeing that kind of the use case to basically stop an existing workflow isn't natively there, but that's something that, you know, kind of as you pointed out, if we're doing a CI use case, you know, and we run a workflow, then an update to the pull request happens. We want to have the ability to cancel the existing workflows that are associated with that.
Yeah, it's a common feature in other CI tools, and so Elo, I don't know a proper name to go with that, or maybe that is a proper name. Was asking to be able to queue them up so that they didn't overlap each other and potentially overtake each other, because that could end up in a result where you see if one overtook, if a later PR was overtaken by an if a later PR ran quicker than an earlier PR, the earlier PR would be the last to finish and may publish its results after the later PR, and you get false results in the pull request view. So that's a bad thing. So he was initially asking, she was initially asking for queuing capabilities, which you can do with a mutex. But I suggested what we're doing internally at Pipekit. And we've had some other requests for, which is to cancel the old job so the new one takes precedence and the old one stops burning through your server hamsters. And there's a little script there that we use to store a running workflow in a config map, and then check that config map to find out whether somebody else is, whether there's an existing workflow running, and if so, cancel that. It's not bulletproof. In certain circumstances, you could find holes in this, but it's probably good enough for most PRs. We've also had requests to do the opposite, where if you start if you start a job and there's already one of that kind of job running, we don't want to carry on with this job. We'd like to cancel ourselves effectively, which is basically doing the inverse of this. If you swap over the sort of if and else blocks of that work, then it will do the opposite. It will self-cancel. You just want to exit instead. Go on.
Sorry, I was going to ask him what would be the use cases of the inverse. So the canceling the existing workflow in favor of the new one. That's like a pretty standard CI use case. Do you remember off the top of your head what were the use cases for canceling the new workflow in favor of the existing?
If what you're doing is not taking new input, effectively you're asking to run the same thing and you're halfway through a 6-hour job, what you don't want to do is cancel your 6-hour job, lose all that lost work. You just want to tell the user, whoever, you know, inform the user through a log message or whatever, that whatever mechanism you like, that they've tried to start a workflow, but there's already one in progress, and this would just be a waste of server hamsters again, that they would be slowing down the end result coming out the back end of this thing. There are some people who sort of do some sorts of streaming with workflows, and again, you want to keep your existing streams going if they're still going, rather than cancelling the existing streams. You don't want to start up a new one. So those are the use cases I can think of.
Makes sense. And sorry for cutting you off. What were you saying previous to my rude interruption?
I've forgotten now.
Bummer. I killed the train of thought. My sincerest apologies.
That's fine.
Maybe next question is, it looked like there was a bit of a discussion on maybe figuring out how to do this natively within Argo workflows, like adding it into like making it a core feature, or I would say at a very minimum, that seems like something that would be very easy to do within our Pipekit product. What are your thoughts on, adding this as like a native feature potentially? Like what would that look like versus, within our SaaS product?
So we've already got cron jobs to model off and cron workflows. So cron workflows and cron jobs have a concurrency policy, which is normally allow. And then there's two other options, which are replace and forbid. So in the replace, that's our CI example, we're going to replace this one with another one and with a new one. And if forbid, the concurrency gets forbidden, we would just immediately cancel the new run. That's our second. We've got long running things that we don't want to abort. So those, if we had those policies implemented outside of cron workflows on standard workflows, that's doable and makes sense. It's the problem being what set of workflows do we consider to be within the set that are forbidden or replacing? Because in a PR run, PR number 12 and PR number 13 don't want to replace each other. So they need to know information that's not just which workflow template are we running, which is potentially an idea. They need to have some sort of label selector effectively, and that's what I'm intending to propose, is that we have a label selector that allows you to select based on the label, and then you could put the PR number into a label as well, and then you would be looking for your sort of siblings that you're going to replace as being labeled up for PR run 12, and so you would be able to find them and replace them. So that's the slight complexity over cron jobs and cron workflows, because cron workflows and cron jobs both have a parent object from which they're created, which isn't necessarily the case in ad hoc workflows that are coming in from maybe Argo events or from people pressing buttons in the user interface.
Definitely makes sense. I feel like this is one where, not to get too overly promotional of our SaaS product, but the concept of like a workflow that gets consistently ran would make this a bit easier. So let me see if I can pull up what that would look like. I'll just pull up our prod instance. Of course, I find all of the cron items. Here's a CI job that I will now share. Cool. So here is like our SaaS product, and we can see the like CI for our examples repository. And we can see like, hey, here's a series of workflows that is getting run like over and over and over again. This kind of provides like a clear history of, all right, cool, new PR that corresponds to like the same branch is getting pushed. We would want to just do like the cancellation of the one that is currently like in flight. But kind of to your point, within like a vanilla Argo workflows context, it becomes a bit harder to track like the metadata of what's associated with that workflow run. And we would have to rely on, like labels in order to figure out like what is existing there.
Yeah, we need some way of pairing them up, which Pipekit already. Pipekit has the fundamental unit of pipes, which allows that kind of operation more easily.
I think there's also the question of like within the vanilla Argo workflows context, we're trying to store maybe a bit of state or like add a bit of persistence of like what is like this PR concept or what is like happening within this like workflow, but within a cloud native at least like Kubernetes compute world, things are generally supposed to be like more ephemeral, uh, get run once and then maybe stay within local memory for a while. But after a while, we are assuming that it's going to get cleaned out. Whereas having like a state store like makes that tracking of like the PRs like much easier.
It does, yeah. An idea that while I was trying to explore what we could do, an idea for what was to encapsulate all that with another custom resource effectively. You could deploy a custom resource describing a group of workflows, but it felt overkill compared to just sort of being able to put labels on. It's probably sort of somewhat more robust in some dimensions, but you still, again, you don't want to store too much in the way of state, and somebody then has to keep that state up to date if you're doing it that way. So it was more just a way of defining outside of a workflow something that was a grouping of workflows.
Essentially rebuilding our pipes primitive, but with a CRD and in the open source.
Yeah, might get me no job, so that's not so good either.
It's all good. All right. Any other items on the stopping like existing or future workflow runs? Otherwise, we'll get into our next agenda item.
I don't have anything, no.
All right, cool. Let me pull up the Slack again in that case. All right, so this was a good question related to getting parameters from secrets. So I'll quickly read through it. Is there a reason why the parameter struct for output input arguments do not support the secret key ref? I want my HTTP template to send in an authorization header. Can't just use the secret key ref, even though it's supported by HTTP header source type, since I also need to use bearer. So I need something like the following. But I can't easily get the authorization value as an input since it doesn't support secret key ref.
It's a slightly odd one from a pure code point of view. Implementing both of them feels identical. Config map key ref and secret key ref. Sorry, I didn't say config map key ref because it's already in my brain. But so config maps and secrets under the hood are pretty much the same thing as each other. And the only reason I can think that nobody's implemented this is because secrets should be kept secret. And there's very little in the way of redaction done in Argo workflows in general. And you would not want your secret keys to leak out through not your secret values, really, not your secret keys. The values that are held in your secrets should not be being exposed by workflows to people who wouldn't otherwise be able to get hold of them. And ideally, even not to the people who can get hold of them, not through easy means. And that's actually quite difficult because we copy the secret key values into their use places. So where you have something that says input.parameters. Something, and that something has come from a config map, by the time you get to looking at it in various places, it will have the value of something that's come out of the config map, rather than saying its original squiggly brackets, please replace me template. view. And if that was then replaced with something from a secret, it'd be sort of bringing secrets into visibility. And I think that's the real reason that none of this has not been tackled properly. There are issues and pull requests related to it, but nobody's yet done enough to hide all of these things from all the places where it should be, so that you could easily do this. The trouble is, it will end up in the workflow status block with the current implementation. I don't think that's that's avoidable without massive amounts of rework. So
yeah, so within the, like, let's say this workflow ran, the actual value of this person's bearer token would get like substituted within this block right here. And this would be publicly visible within the workflow status whenever someone was doing like a, just a simple like get of the workflow, or viewing it within the UI. And that's probably not bad for like a bearer token, or not too bad for like a bearer token, but for something that could be, way worse, like let's say a database password or something like that, that seems like pretty nightmare-ish.
Yeah. So that's, I'm assuming that's the reason it's not been done. I wasn't around when it was originally implemented. It's a very old feature for config maps, but it feels like that's the major blocker to getting secret. So if you do want to do secrets, what we do internally for ours system is we substitute in, we pull them in from HashiCorp Vault using the side init container. So the init container gets values from Vault and then injects them into our pods, bypassing all the templating and bypassing workflows actually seeing those values at all. You could do the same with any kind of, you could grant your pod permission to read from secrets and use that to get them out of the cluster. There are lots of workarounds for it, but it's not as user friendly as a properly implemented secret key ref would be.
So I might be understanding that wrong, but in the, assuming the like vault like substitution, that still wouldn't be available within an input parameter, right? It's like this person or nom would have to refactor the HTTP template to be like a more of a normal like container type template or script template that is going to actually run like curl or something to make the request, and then rely on that secret to be present to get the bearer token. And since that secret is just within the being interpolated into the pod itself, it's not going to be persisted within the parameters. Am I thinking about that correctly, or am I off?
Yeah, you could use curl the way the definitely script or pods would be needed. You couldn't do it with an HTTP template like this. The way HashiCorp Vault's thing works is there's actually a mutating webhook that does all the work for you if you just annotate your pod correctly. And annotating your pod correctly is a pretty dark art involving many squiggly brackets and things again, but you can put, once you've got it working once, you can crib that. You put annotations on your pod, and then the mutating webhook creates the init container automatically for you and feeds that data in through a volume mount, I believe.
I'm glad you and Tim are on the team. Every time I hear mutating webhook, I panic a little bit after having broken some clusters previously when playing with them.
I think it's part of mutating webhooks that they must break a cluster from time to time. Yeah, my earliest, oh dear, I've broken the entire cluster and I'm going to delete it experiences were with mutating webhooks for mission control mission controlling everything that meant that nothing could ever get created once they had died. That was bad.
Makes sense. Yeah, I feel like that's a lot of Kubernetes startups, whenever they're, writing their SaaS product or whatever, often like reach for that mutating webhook, given how powerful it can be. But then if you're not pretty on the nail with how it works, and there's no bugs, you can very easily like break your end customers' clusters, which is not something you want to be associated with as a like SaaS provider. So I not to toot our own horn too much, but I think it was a good choice to not go down that route at Pipekit.
When they work, they can be very effective. I have one that didn't break everything that I've written. So yeah, I'm gonna that's that job done, and I'm not doing it again.
You thread the needle.
Yeah.
All right. Any more items for us to go over before we wrap this one up?
I don't have anything.
All right. In that case, good seeing you, Alan.
And you, take care.